41 million people are not obliged to wait around while this party sorts out its shit.
Welcome to my channel, y'all. I hope you're having a great day. Well, I wasn't actually going to do a video on this, but I just couldn't help myself after watching this, even though almost every other political commentator has done a video on the Jordan Peterson interview of Pierre Poilievre. I had to draw out a few of the highlights for myself and make some comments on it. So without further ado, let's get into this.
I've been very blessed because my caucus is extremely talented and they don't need a lot of direction. But we've been acting in unison, and I think that's why our message is pumping out so clearly to people. It's not a cacophony of sound, it's a clear drumbeat. That's why people are hearing and appreciating our message.
I think that's very important. You have to have a clear message, and you have to have people working in unison so that they can get that message out. In contrary, you look at the Liberals or the NDP, and what message do they have? They don't really seem to have a single message, or they don't seem to have a single focus. They're kind of all over the place. They grab a hold of these socialist ideas and they just kind of shove them in our faces, but they don't really have a clear message other than they want to stay in power and get their pensions.
So you feel that your party is well organized at the moment?
Extremely well organized.
Okay, so what's your evidence for that?
Well, by every measure, by every statistical measure, we're stronger than any political party has been in, well, maybe in my lifetime, objectively speaking. Memberships, fundraising, poll numbers.
Right, so people are positive in consequence of that. So it's a lot easier to lead an organization when it's successful.
That's
Obviously,
right.
People are much more enthusiastic.
Yes.
Why do you think you're in that position? What's going on that's setting the stage for that? And I don't just mean the failures on the Trudeau side. I mean, what do you think you guys are doing right?
Well, we have a clear mission statement, and people know exactly why we're in this. Whenever someone asks me if they say, I'm thinking of running for parliament or for mayor or some other political position, what's your advice? Well, I said, well, before I get to the advice, I have a very simple question. Why do you want this job? Mm-hmm. And it might seem like a simplistic question, but it's actually the most important question in life. Why? Why are you doing what you're doing?
And that is a very good question. You do have to have an answer to that. You have to have an answer to why you want to do something. It just can't be, well, that is a good job and it pays well and it has all these benefits, and then I can retire with a pension. Because at that point, you're simply trading hours for dollars, and you're not really getting a whole lot of enjoyment out of your job, and you don't feel like you're making a difference.
Our answer to that is to bring back the Canadian promise that anyone who works hard gets a great paycheck and a pension that buys them good food and a nice home and a safe neighborhood, that anyone from anywhere can do anything, and that people are in charge of their own lives.
And that's what you want to hear from a politician. You want to hear that the politician is in it for you. Now, of course, you don't have to believe them all the time, but I do believe Pierre Poilievre. I don't believe that Trudeau or Singh or anyone else, any other party in the government is in it for us. I think they're in it for them.
So that's a very local vision in a sense, right? It doesn't have the grandiosity of an international utopian vision, for example.
Well, maybe
it's very down to earth.
I think people are sick and tired of grandiosity. In fact, I think there's something grand about a family that can go on a nice road trip and share stories and build lasting memories that the kids will remember when they're 85 years old.
Despite
I think that's
producing all that nasty carbon dioxide.
That's right. I think those things are grand. And I think with the problem we've had in this country and in all of the countries that have been afflicted by this horrendous utopian wokeism is that it's been focused on the grandiosity of the leadership, of the egotistical personalities on top, and not the things that are grand and great about the common people. And that is another reason why I think we're doing very well. People are saying, finally, there's someone who's focused on letting me take back control of my own life and create a great future for my family. So that is, to answer your question, one of the reasons why we've had such incredible success over the last 2 years.
When a leader speaks from their heart, you tend to believe them. And I do believe that Pierre Poilievre is speaking from his heart. And I think that he does have a good plan for the future.
I've been tracking economic statistics in relationship to Canada and sort of left me open-mouthed in amazement at our dismal condition. So from what I've been able to understand, the richest people per capita in terms of GDP per person, gross domestic product per person, so that's total productivity, is Ontario. And Ontario inhabitants are now poorer per capita than inhabitants of Mississippi, and that's the poorest American state. And that's not all the bad news, because it's 60% in terms of absolute wealth, and a real estate market that's twice as expensive approximately on average.
Yeah, it's really bad. It's really incredible. Like 10 years ago, the New York Times wrote an article, Welcome to Canada, we're home of the world's most affluent middle class. And in that article, the Times had calculated that median American and Canadian incomes were tied, and that Canadians were slightly better off. Now, part of that was because of the 08-09 financial crisis hit them harder than it hit us, but still.
At the time, it was widely accepted that Harper's financial strategy and how he ran the country was the main reason why the financial crash of 2008, 2009 hit the Americans harder than it hit Canada. And then, of course, what happened later? Well, Trudeau came to power.
Now, per capita GDP in the States is $22,000 higher than in Canada, measured in USD. So that's about almost 30,000 measured in.
Right, so that's a whole other income, essentially.
Yes.
That's a whole other part-time income.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, as you correctly point out, their real estate is significantly cheaper than ours. So their dollars go a lot further, even when you match up the exchange rates. And what's worse than that is that the leading indicators are even more horrific. And leading indicators, for example, are investment dollars, because your wealth tomorrow is determined by your investment today. So if your employer, for example, is buying lots of new tools and technology, you're going to be able to crank out more widgets. So you crank out those widgets, then you can ultimately make more income down the road. If you take business investment and divide it by the number of workers, the American worker gets $28,000 of investment measured in US dollars.
This is per capita?
Per worker.
Or per year?
Per worker, per member of the labor force.
Okay.
So you take the total business investment of the United States divided by the total number of workers in America, it's 28 grand. In Canada, it's 15 grand. So the Canadian worker gets about 55 cents for every dollar of his American, and they're both measured in USD. So how is the Canadian worker?
That's investment in future productivity?
That's investment in machines, in technology, in warehouses, factories.
I see.
Any capital investment that businesses make divided by the number of workers, that's the measurement. So now that means they're getting better technology, better new machines, better tools than our workers, and they will be able to crank out even greater wages for their people than we will, unless we catch up with that.
And that's the story of socialism across the board. When you have a socialist government like we have in Canada, your economy stagnates. And all you have to do is look at other socialist countries around the world throughout history in order to come to this conclusion. Look at Cuba, for example. Back in the day when Castro came to power, prior to that, they actually had a pretty good economy. After Castro came to power, their economy stagnated and people started to flee Cuba. And guess what? They're starting to flee Canada now. Why is that? Because they can have a better standard of living elsewhere in the world, especially in places like the United States.
Our productivity is another major problem. Right now, and that's productivity sounds complicated. It's actually extremely simple. You just take the GDP and you divide it by the hours worked in the country. So American GDP is $80. So for every hour an American worker works, on average, he or she produces $80 of GDP. Mm-hmm. In Canada, it's 50. So that means we have to work 60% more just to make the same amount and have the same level of income to buy food and housing. That's reflected in the fact that our 2 million people are lined up at food banks because they can't afford food, and 80% of youth can't afford homes. And our quality of life and the things we can afford to provide our kids have fallen back so much.
Well, is there a starker indicator of the economic disparity between the U.S. and Canada than that?
I think housing costs are another one.
Right,
There was a study out just 10 days ago that has Toronto and Vancouver now by far the most unaffordable housing markets in North America. And so, housing costs are 50% higher in Toronto than they are in Chicago, even though Chicago workers make 50% more money. The same is true between Vancouver and Seattle. Seattle workers make way more than Vancouver workers, but housing is 60 or 70% more expensive in Vancouver.
And that, my friends, is an example of quality of life. We are making a lot less money and we are paying a lot more. So it amplifies the difference between our two cities, Vancouver and Seattle, or Toronto and Chicago.
And we're paying the difference by accumulating enormous quantities of debt. Our households are by far the most indebted in the G7. When you divide total household debt by GDP, we now have a bigger stock of household debt than our entire economy. We are more indebted as households than the Americans were right before the 2008 financial crisis. And so what we have as a model in Canada is we have artificial scarcity imposed by a very heavy and restrictive state, confiscatory state. So that suppresses production. Mm-hmm. But in order to allow for consumption, we print money and borrow money and then flood the economy with that.
And that's what causes inflation. Now let's have a listen to what Pierre Poilievre says about inflation and how it is actually a tax.
Well, inflation is the single most immoral tax for so many reasons. One, it takes from savers and people who are trying to be responsible, thus making it impossible to be responsible. Right. Because you will, if you refuse to play the inflation game of borrowing money to buy things you can't afford, someone else inevitably will, and you won't be able to afford anything. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you ultimately have to act responsibly. It's like Milton Friedman was asked, what would you do with your money in times of inflation? He said, spend it.
Right.
Like the first thing you want to do when inflation is out of control is to make sure you get rid of this thing that's losing its value. The second reason it's immoral is it takes from the poor, because the poorest people they do not have the ability to buy inflation-proof assets like gold and real estate and fancy watches and art collections and fancy wines and things that go up with or even exceed inflation. So it's a very big wealth transfer from the poor and the working class to the very, very wealthy. A very small group of people actually get richer.
So the socialist policies that provide goods and services to Canadians, let's say, or denizens of other countries, by printing money, actually punish the poor brutally.
Oh, absolutely.
In consequence of the inflation that they generate.
Yes. I mean, all the socialist policies in practice redistribute from the working class to the super wealthy. The final reason why it's so immoral is nobody votes on it. The basic principle of our parliamentary system is the government can't tax what Parliament has not voted. The people no taxation without representation, right? But no one ever votes to have the money printing happen. And so the inflation is adopted secretly, and you blame the grocer because groceries are more expensive, or your local gas station because gas is more, or your realtor because when in fact it was actually the government that bid up all of those things with money printing, and you didn't even know about it.
Kind of reminds you of the Maserati Marxists blaming everybody else for higher prices and not taking any responsibility for propping up this inflationary government.
Okay, so what would you do to stop inflation?
Well, we stop the money printing. You know, and the money printing is just a means to fund deficit spending. Deficits increase the money supply. Central banks effectively facilitate that increase in the money supply, and that causes inflation.
So guess what? The ultra-rich, the Mark Carneys of the world, the bankers, are the ones that are promoting this problem because they don't really care. They're seen as these really smart economists, but they're actually not. They're the ultra wealthy that Pierre talked about earlier, where the working class people and everybody else transfers their money to the ultra wealthy in socialist societies. And that's why a lot of ultra wealthy people actually like socialist societies.
What we have to do is stop growing the money supply and start growing the stuff money buys. Produce more energy, grow more food, build more homes. We have to unleash the free enterprise system to produce more stuff of value. And this is where we have to remove the artificial scarcity that the government is imposing on the population.
A lot of low information people always complain about capitalism, but why? Capitalism, the free market, that's actually a very organic system or economic system. It grew out of the barter system. It grew naturally. All of these unnatural systems that we try to impose on people, they always fail. So that's what I like about people like Trump. They're capitalists. They know how economies actually work. They may not have PhDs, but they have practical experience.
Let's incentivize our municipalities to grant the fastest building permits in the world to build homes. I'm going to say to the municipal governments, they either speed up permits, cut development charges, and free up land, or they will lose their federal infrastructure money. So they will have a powerful carrot and stick incentive to speed up home building.
And the percentage of a new house price that's a consequence of government taxation and regulation?
Well, in Vancouver, it's 60%.
60%. Now, does that include the land and the house?
Yes, that includes everything. So I'll tell you how they calculate it. C.D. Howe took the cost of compared the cost of building a home to the cost of buying a home.
Yeah.
And he said, what's the gap between those two things? So they added up land, labor, profit for the developer, materials, and they compared that to the sale price. And they found the gap was $1.2 million. So that's $1.2 million of extra cost above and beyond the materials, the labor, the land, and the profit for the developer. So where's that going? Well, the answer is development charges, sales taxes, land transfer taxes, the delays in getting the permit, time is money, the consultants, lawyers, accountants, lobbyists that the developer has to hire in order to get the approval. We spend twice as much on bureaucrats than we do on all other things combined to build a home. More money goes to bureaucrats than goes to the carpenters, electricians, and plumbers who build the place. And to add insult to injury, tradespeople who build homes can't afford to live in them. So what we need to do is slash the bureaucracy. We should have the most affordable housing in the world. It should be dirt cheap because we have the most dirt. We just need to get the government out of the way. The same goes for our resource sector. I mean, why is it that we're still importing oil when we've got the world's third biggest supply?
And why is it that we have to export our oil to the U.S., where it goes down to the Gulf Coast to get refined, and then they sell us the gasoline? We should be refining our own gasoline.
Why is it we can't export our natural gas overseas?
You mean like to Germany and Japan, even when they ask?
Exactly.
And are offering multi-decade contract at distressed prices because they're so desperate for energy. Right. And we can't make a business case for that, famously. I think that was perhaps the single stupidest thing I ever heard a politician say. And that's a really hard contest to win.
Personally, I think Trudeau has won the gold medal in stupid things that politicians say.
What did we do wrong as a country?
What I'm about to say is not a shock to anyone. We have a prime minister who is dedicated to a extremely radical ideology. It is just a rehashed socialism that has been discredited again and again and again throughout the ages. And his authoritarian socialism has guided him throughout his entire prime ministership. He believes in a state that controls every aspect of your life, your money, your speech, your thought. Controls the economic, all of the industries of the country, Every time that has been tried, it is a complete disaster. So there's no mystery involved. It is the same old disastrous outcome that results from the same old disastrous policies.
Right, that have demonstrated themselves as disastrous continuously throughout the 20th century. Frankly speaking, I don't envy you your job. Or the people, by the way, in the Trump administration, because it's very glamorous at the moment for them. But if they're going to cut government inefficiency in a serious manner, they're going to be doing hard administrative labor for a very long period of time. Now, you're going to take the helm of Canada when there are 5 dimensions of trouble brewing, and more serious trouble on all of those dimensions than I've ever seen plague Canada in my entire life as a Canadian. And it's worse than that, because I suspect that the true picture is a lot more dismal than we know.
Yes.
Okay, so that's going to be dumped on you sometime in the next year. How are you going to deal with the fact that the easiest thing to do for Canadians and for the remnants of the legacy media will be to wait until the Trudeau government collapses completely, dumps the economic mess on your shoulders, and then 2 months later proclaim that it's your fault.
Right.
Well, and it will be your responsibility at that point. And so,
they get the party, I get the hangover.
And this is a very good point. And we see this almost every time the Conservatives take power, because they have to clean up the mess of the previous Liberal government. And they ultimately get blamed for all the cuts and all the austerity programs that they have to impose. And we're going to have to be intelligent enough as a nation not to let that happen, not to forget what the Liberals did to us.
But it's going to be a big fight with all of these things, because there are so many vested interests that will be trying to hold us back, that have profited off the status quo. They will be fighting against me. And I'm going to have to put out a call to Canadians that they have to stay politically active. They can't assume that simply by voting in an election that everything is going to, all the problems are going to reverse instantaneously. I will need people to put pressure on the Senate to adopt my economic reforms. I will need people to put pressure on their mayors and local councillors to get out of the way and let us build homes. I will need businesses to actually do their part. I mean, our corporate Canada is so completely incompetent when it comes to politics. They're going to have to start to fight for the policies that are good for their workers more aggressively. And I've said that to them. They need to fire their incompetent lobbyists and actually go to the people and make the arguments for the reforms that I'm talking about.
These are larger businesses, I presume. Do they understand your concerns? Are they on board with your suggestions?
They're starting to understand, because they know that what they have been doing hasn't worked.
Well, the energy companies have been towing the green line, which seems to me to be a very bad strategy.
They're idiots. They're complete idiots. The big 5 oil companies in Canada have idiot lobbyists. They have brilliant workers, incredible workers, but idiot lobbyists. And they've been trying to suck up for the last 10 years and did nothing to support the right policies in the prior years. So that's going to have to change. The developers are going to have to inform people in the cities why housing costs so much. You know, how is it possible that Olivia Chow can raise development charges by 30% and nobody in Toronto knows about it? Well, it's because the builders have not made it known. And so the builders take the blame when the housing costs go up. I mean, sorry, you have to actually, politics is a participation sport, not a spectator sport.
And that's a very important point. We all have to keep engaged. We all have to keep the pressure on not only our politicians, but on the lobbyists, these idiot lobbyists, as Pierre says. Now, I think I'm going to close off the video there. I was hoping that he would get into the 51st state comments that Trump made and the economic union that Kevin O'Leary has been talking about. And apparently he does get into that, but it's not until this interview goes to the behind the Daily Wire paywall. And I don't have a Daily Wire paywall subscription, so I missed out on that. But maybe I'll be able to see a little bit of that later. I don't know. Maybe we'll be able to hear Pierre Poilievre talk about that in the future, which would be very interesting. But that's just my opinion. I'd love to know what you think. Put your comments down below. And while you're at it, please like this video, share with your friends and on social media. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and hit that bell notification so you never miss another video. Also, please join me on Thursday evenings at 6 p.m. Pacific time on YouTube and Rumble for my live stream, where you're invited to join in on the conversation. Finally, if you reside on Vancouver Island and you need your firearms license, you require a course. I happen to teach those courses. So if you'd like to take a course from me, there are links in the show notes of this video to my website where you can sign up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.